The first time Sarah Whitfield saved a man's life, she was 17 years old, and nobody said thank you. That was the way of things in Calico Creek, Texas, in the autumn of 1878. The town sat pressed between two limestone ridges like a coin caught between a man's fingers, and the wind that swept down from the north in October carried dust and indifference in equal measure. People needed saving regularly in Calico Creek from fever, from bad water, from their own stubbornness, and they accepted salvation the way they accepted rain, gratefully in the moment and then quickly forgotten once the sun came back out. Sarah had grown up watching her mother nurse the sick. Her mother, Eleanor Whitfield, had been a firm woman with capable hands and the practical belief that healing was simply what decent people did. She had taught Sarah to wrap a wound cleanly, to brew willow bark tea for fever, to hold a dying man's hand without flinching, and to keep her own grief quiet in her chest until she was well away from anyone who might see it. Eleanor Whitfield had died of a lung sickness in the winter of 1876, when Sarah was 15, and what she left behind was a modest cabin on the eastern edge of Calico Creek, a battered medical satchel, and a daughter who had absorbed every lesson as though her life depended on it. By the time Sarah was 26, in the late summer of 1887, she had nursed Calico Creek through 3 separate epidemics and had done it largely alone. The first had been a cholera outbreak in 1881, when the creek itself had gone foul after a prolonged drought pushed families to dig shallow wells too close to the town's refuse pit. Sarah had been 20 years old and not yet sure of herself, but she had gone door to door with clean water she had hauled from a spring 3 miles east. She had mixed rehydration broths from salt and sugar, and whatever broth she could coax from donated chicken bones, and she had sat beside 7 different pallets in 7 different homes and talked people back from the edge of the dark. 3 people had died despite her efforts. 14 had lived who might otherwise have not. The Reverend had said a prayer of thanksgiving at the following Sunday service. He had not mentioned Sarah's name. The second epidemic had come 4 years later, in the winter of 1885. Typhoid fever had crept into the town on the boots of a cattle drive passing through, and it had moved through Calico Creek with the quiet, deliberate hunger of a predator that knows it cannot be seen. Sarah had been 24 by then, more sure-handed and more worn at the same time. She had operated out of the back room of the general store, which the owner, Hector Dunmore, had grudgingly surrendered when the town had run out of other options. She had tended 19 patients over 6 weeks, had lost 2 of them, a grandmother and a young boy of 9, and had not slept more than 4 hours at a stretch for a month and a half. When it was over, Hector Dunmore had asked for his back room back and had given her a tin of hard candy by way of compensation. She had thanked him politely and walked home and sat in the dark for a long time before she lit the lamp. The third epidemic had been the worst. In the June of 1887, just 2 months before the story truly begins, a measles outbreak had torn through the children of Calico Creek with a ferocity that had left parents hollow-eyed and desperate. Sarah had been there through all of it. She had mixed poultices, kept rooms darkened to protect weakened eyes, had cooled small burning foreheads with damp cloths hour after hour, had talked to frightened mothers in the small hours of the morning, and had somehow found the right words every time even when she felt she had none left. 7 children had been at serious risk. 7 children had recovered. The town had been grateful in that vague, collective way that costs nothing and changes nothing, and Sarah Whitfield had gone home to her mother's cabin, set her satchel on the table, sat down in the chair by the cold fireplace, and wondered for the first time whether she was simply tired or whether she was something worse than tired. She was still sitting in that chair when the sound of a rider approaching at speed came through the thin walls of the cabin on the morning of August the 3rd, 1887. She did not move for a moment. She was wearing a plain gray dress, practical and faded, and her brown hair was coming loose from its braid in a way she had not bothered to correct. She was, at 26, A woman who might have been called pretty by anyone who looked at her carefully, which was not many people. Her eyes were a particular shade of gray-green that changed in different light, and her face had the kind of strong, quiet bones that held up well under hard living. But Calico Creek had a habit of looking through Sarah Whitfield rather than at her, in the way that people look through a window rather than at it when what they want is what is on the other side. She rose when the knock came because that was what she did. Whatever was on the other side of her door, she answered it. The man standing on her small porch was a stranger. That in itself was not unusual on the Texas frontier. What was unusual was the state of him. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, wearing a trail-worn canvas duster that had once been brown and was now the color of the road he'd ridden in on. He had a hat in his hand, which she noted, because a man who took his hat off before he knocked was a man who had been raised right, and in 1887 that was worth noting. He was somewhere in his early 30s, with a jaw that had not seen a razor in perhaps a week, dark hair damp with sweat at the temples, and eyes that were green, not gray-green like hers, but a clear, direct green that made her think of creek water after rain. His left arm was wrapped in a makeshift bandage fashioned from what appeared to be a torn shirt, and the bandage was thoroughly soaked through with blood. "Beg your pardon, ma'am," he said, and his voice had a slight roughness to it that might have been pain or might have been who he was. "I was told at the edge of town that you were the person to find." "Come inside," Sarah said, stepping back from the doorway. His name was Matthew McCree. She did not learn this until she had him seated at her kitchen table and had unwound the makeshift bandage from his arm, at which point the arm in question revealed a long, deep gash along the outer forearm that had come from a piece of broken fence rail, or so he explained. He had been helping a rancher named Booth about 12 miles south of Calico Creek secure a remuda before a thunderstorm. The fence had given way under the pressure of spooked horses, and the timber had caught him across the arm as he'd lunged to hold the gate. "Matthew McCree," he said, watching her work with a kind of careful attention that was neither intrusive nor absent. "I was passing through. I'm not usually someone who passes through, but that is how things stand at the moment." "Hold still," Sarah said. She was cleaning the wound with diluted carbolic acid solution, which she had learned about from a medical pamphlet that a traveling physician had left behind 3 years prior. The pain from it was considerable, and Matthew McCree made no sound beyond a brief, controlled intake of breath. She found herself respecting that, the way she respected anyone who dealt with pain cleanly. "You are the doctor?" he asked. "There is no doctor in Calico Creek," Sarah said. "There has not been one since Dr. Greaves left in 1883. I tend to people when they need tending." "That seems like more than a small thing." She glanced up at him briefly. "It is simply what is needed." She stitched the wound with practiced efficiency, using the small curved needle and silk thread that she kept in her satchel for exactly this purpose. Matthew McCree did not look away from the operation, not from bravado but, she thought, from genuine curiosity. He watched her hands with a focus that was different from the way most people watched her hands, which was either with apprehension or with that particular blankness of someone trying not to think about what was happening to their body. "Where are you from?" she asked, because silence while working was something she had never entirely gotten used to, despite how often she experienced it. "Originally, Kentucky," he said. "More recently, everywhere. That is a great deal of territory." "It has been a great deal of years," he said. "I worked cattle drives out of Abilene for 6 years after the war. Took a job as a range hand in Colorado. Tried my hand at a small cattle operation in the New Mexico territory, which did not take. Now I am on my way to see about a parcel of land near the Colorado River that a man in San Antonio tells me is available for reasonable terms. And you ended up in Calico Creek." "Horses and broken fences are not respecters of travel plans," he said, and there was something in his tone that was not quite amusement but was adjacent to it, something warm and dry at the same time. Sarah tied off the last suture and sat back. She had a small bottle of whiskey she kept for wounds. Her mother had kept it too, and she had maintained the tradition, and she cleaned the site once more before applying a fresh bandage of clean cotton cloth. "You should keep this dry for at least 5 days," she said. "The stitches need 10 days before they can come out safely. If you see redness spreading outward from the wound, or if the flesh becomes hot and swollen, you need to find someone who can address that. Red streaks moving up the arm are serious." "I understand," he said. He was looking at her again with that focused quality. "What do I owe you?" 2 bits, she said. It was what she asked of everyone who could pay. She did not ask it of everyone. He paid her and he thanked her, and she showed him to the door, and she expected him to ride on, because that was what people did. They needed her, and then they rode on, and the cabin returned to its quiet, and Sarah Whitfield returned to being the woman who was essential in crisis and invisible in calm. What Matthew McCree did was entirely different. He was back the following morning, before the heat of the day had properly settled in, and he knocked on her door with the same consideration as before. When she opened it, he was holding a wrapped bundle that turned out to contain a dressed rabbit and a sack of flour. "I am staying at the Creek House while I wait to hear back from San Antonio," he said. "I caught this out on the ridge this morning. I thought you might be able to make use of it as payment for yesterday if 2 bits did not cover it adequately." Sarah stared at him for a moment. 2 bits covered it adequately. "Then consider it a gift," he said, without any particular embarrassment, as though offering gifts to strangers was simply a reasonable thing that he did. She took the rabbit, because she was practical and because she had not yet gotten around to visiting Hector Dunmore's store that week, and she told him to come inside and she would check the wound. He sat at her kitchen table again. She unwound the bandage and checked the sutures, which were holding well, and she rewrapped the arm with clean cloth. He watched her work again. "The girl," he said. She looked up. "At the Creek House this morning, Mrs. Crane, who runs the place, was telling me about a measles outbreak in the town. She said a woman had kept all 7 sick children alive. She did not say the woman's name, and I did not know until I arrived here who she meant." Sarah rewound the last of the bandage and tucked it neatly. "It was a difficult month," she said. "I imagine it was considerably more than difficult. Children should not be left to suffer when they can be helped," she said, in the tone she used when she did not want to discuss something further. Matthew McCree was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I heard Mrs. Crane say those words in a tone like it was simply a thing that had happened, like weather. Like it had nothing to do with any particular person doing a particular thing." "That is often how people see it," Sarah said, and she heard the flatness in her own voice and was mildly surprised by it, because she was not normally a person who revealed herself in that way. "Does that not bother you?" he asked. She picked up her satchel and began organizing its contents, which did not need organizing but gave her hands something to do. "I do not do it to be noticed," she said. "I did not ask whether you did it to be noticed," he said. "I asked whether it bothered you." The question sat in the kitchen air between them. Outside, a mockingbird was going through its catalog of borrowed songs on the branch of the live oak beside the cabin window. Sarah set down the satchel. "You should rest that arm," she said. "No heavy work for a week." Matthew McCree accepted the change of subject without protest, but he did not leave, and he came back the next morning and the morning after that. It became a rhythm before either of them fully recognized it as such. He would come in the early morning, ostensibly to have the wound checked, and she would check it, and then he would sit at her kitchen table while she prepared her day's medicines and broths and supplies, and he would talk to her. Not at her, the way some men talked, filling the air to hear their own voices, but to her, in the way that implied he was interested in where the words landed and what they touched. He told her about the cattle drives. The long, repetitive loneliness of moving 10,000 animals across flat land in the heat, the camaraderie of the other hands that was real and also limiting in the way that things held together by necessity are always somewhat limiting. He told her about the operation in New Mexico, a modest spread he had worked for 2 years before a combination of drought and falling cattle prices had made it untenable. He told her about his parents, who had farmed in Kentucky and were both gone now, and about a younger brother named Caleb who had died of a fever at 7 years old, which he mentioned once and only briefly, but it settled in the room like something solid. In return, Sarah found herself talking in ways she had not in years. She told him about her mother, about the medical satchel, about the methodical way that Eleanor Whitfield had approached healing, as though illness were a problem to be solved through persistence and clear thinking. She told him about learning to stitch a wound at 14 on a neighbor's dog before she had tried it on any person, and the quiet, private satisfaction she had felt when the dog had recovered completely. She did not tell him about the loneliness. She did not tell him about the way Calico Creek looked through her. But she thought he sensed it, because he listened to everything with that green-eyed attention that made her feel, in a way she could not quite articulate, that she was being seen. On the 5th day, Matthew McCree did not come in the morning. He came instead in the late afternoon, and he brought 2 tins of peaches from Dunmore's store and a quiet apology for being late, which he explained was because he had spent the morning helping a widow named Mrs. Perez mend her roof before the next rain came. Mrs. Perez lived at the southern end of town, was 72 years old, and had been a neighbor of Sarah's mother. "You fixed her roof," Sarah said, not quite a question. "Partially," Matthew said. "I will go back tomorrow to finish it." "It would be better with 2 people." Sarah looked at him across the small table with its tin of peaches and its afternoon light coming in sideways through the window. "I can hold a beam," she said. "I know you can," he said, with that particular certainty that she had come to realize was simply how Matthew McCree stated things. Not arrogantly, but as facts he had already arrived at through observation. "That is why I mentioned it." They spent the following morning on Mrs. Perez's roof, which proved to be in considerably worse shape than the outside had suggested. Mrs. Perez stood below and called up advice in a mixture of Spanish and English, and Sarah found herself laughing, an actual unguarded laugh, at something Matthew said about the roof having strong opinions about the repair process. She had not laughed that way in a long time, and she was aware of it the way you are aware of a muscle you have not used. The sound of it surprised her. It surprised Matthew too, she thought, because he turned and looked at her with an expression she could not entirely interpret, something that was careful and warm, and had in it the quality of a man who has just discovered something he did not know he had been looking for. They ate the cold biscuits Mrs. Perez insisted on pressing into their hands at noon, sitting on the porch steps with sawdust on their clothes, and the summer heat pressing down on everything like a flat, warm hand. Matthew poured 2 cups of water from the jug Mrs. Perez had left out, and he handed one to Sarah, and she took it. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You have been asking me things for a week," she said. "True," he said, "but this is different." She looked at him. He was looking down at his water cup. "How long have you been doing this?" he asked. "The nursing, the epidemics, all of it." "Since I was 17, she said. "Approximately." 9 years, he said, doing the arithmetic. 9 years of this kind of work. "And you are here, and the town goes about its business." He was not accusatory, not precisely. He was thoughtful, in the way of a man who has been turning something over for several days and has finally decided to address it directly. "That is the nature of it," Sarah said, and reached for a biscuit. "Does anyone in this town know what it costs you?" he asked. And that was the question. That was the question no one had ever asked her. Not in 9 years. Not through cholera and typhoid and measles and the dozens of smaller crises in between. Not through the nights she had sat beside strangers in their pain while her own body ached with exhaustion and her own heart kept its silence. Nobody had ever looked at Sarah Whitfield and asked what it cost her. She had not expected the question to do what it did to her. She had not expected the tears that came without warning, not dramatically, not in a flood, but steadily, quietly, the way water comes up through the floor of a low-lying cabin in a heavy rain. She turned her face away from him, pressing her fingers against her eyes with a fierceness that was mostly mortification. "I beg your pardon," she said, in a voice that was steady only barely. "I don't know what has come over me." Matthew McCree did not say anything for a moment. He did not move, did not reach for her, did not fill the air with reassurances. He simply waited in the particular still way he had until she had gotten hold of herself, and then he said, quietly and without any performance, "You do not have to beg anyone's pardon for that." She wiped her face with the back of her hand. The biscuit was still in her other hand, and she was aware dimly that she was still holding it, which was somehow the most absurd detail of the moment. "I do not cry," she said, which was almost true. "I am not a woman who cries." "Every person cries," Matthew said. "Anyone who claims otherwise has simply not been asked the right question at the right time." She looked at him then, turning back to face him with her reddened eyes and her composed, strong face, and all 9 years of silence sitting in her chest, and he looked back at her with that green-eyed steadiness that did not flinch and did not demand anything. And something happened in that moment on Mrs. Perez's porch steps that neither of them spoke about immediately, but that both of them understood completely. The message from San Antonio arrived 4 days later. Matthew told her about it over the evening meal, which by this point in the second week had somehow become a regular thing. He had cooked, because he had discovered early on that Sarah's approach to feeding herself was perfunctory at best. She ate for fuel rather than pleasure, which he found she had in common with other people who spent most of their energy on others. He was a surprisingly capable cook for a man who had spent years on cattle drives, and he explained that on the long drives you either learned to cook decently or you ate badly for months, and he had had enough bad meals in his life to be motivated. The message was from the man in San Antonio. The parcel of land by the Colorado River was still available. The terms were acceptable. There was a farmhouse on the property, modest but sound, and there were 60 acres of decent grassland that had not been overgrazed. If Matthew was interested, he needed to make his decision within the month. "Are you going?" Sarah asked. She was looking at her plate and she spoke in a tone of careful neutrality that she had some experience with. "I have been thinking about it," he said. "It sounds like a good piece of land." "It does," he said. He set down his fork. "It would be better with someone to share it." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the evening sounds of Calico Creek went about their business, a horse at the hitching post down the road, a door closing somewhere, the distant voice of someone calling a child in for supper. "Matthew," Sarah said. "I know," he said. "I know we have known each other less than 2 weeks. I know that is not a long time. I am not a man who is generally given to acting quickly in matters of importance. But I have spent the last several days attempting to imagine leaving Calico Creek without you, and I find I cannot make the picture sit still." She raised her eyes to his. "I have spent 9 years in this town," she said. "I do not know who I am outside of it." "I think," he said carefully, "that who you are has very little to do with this particular town. I think you would be who you are anywhere. You have known me for 12 days. "I know," he said, "and I know that 12 days is not a sufficient argument for a lifetime arrangement. I am not asking you to answer tonight. I am asking you to consider it. Consider whether what is here is worth more than what might be there. Consider whether the people of Calico Creek have given you back half of what you have given them. Consider," he stopped. He picked up his fork, then set it down again. "Consider whether you want to keep giving everything you have to people who look through you, or whether you might want to give some of it to someone who is making a deliberate effort to look at you instead." Sarah Whitfield sat with that for a long moment. The lamplight made the kitchen warm and amber, and the biscuits he had made were genuinely good, which she registered with a small part of her mind that was not entirely occupied with the enormity of what was happening. "I need some time," she said. "I have 3 weeks," he said. "Take all of them if you need them." She did not take all 3 weeks. She took 8 days. During those 8 days, she went about her work, and Matthew McCree went about his, and they still shared evenings and still talked with that easy, thorough honesty that had established itself between them like something that had always been there. And Sarah thought about it the way she thought about every serious problem, which was systematically and without sentiment until the sentiment became unavoidable. She thought about the cholera epidemic, the 57 consecutive hours she had been awake during the worst of it. She thought about the typhoid, about coming home to the empty cabin on Christmas Eve of 1885, and sitting at this same table and eating alone and feeling nothing about it, because feeling nothing was easier than feeling something. She thought about the measles outbreak, about the night the Henderson boy had been so hot she had genuinely feared for him, and how she had held his hand and talked to him until 3 in the morning and then had walked home in the dark alone with the stars cold and indifferent overhead, and had thought, not for the first time, that this was simply what her life was. She thought about Matthew's hands, which were working hands but careful ones, the kind of hands that fixed an old woman's roof without being asked and cooked meals that someone else had been neglecting to eat. She thought about the way he listened. She thought about Mrs. Perez's porch steps and the question that had broken something open in her chest that she had not realized was sealed. She thought about the fact that the land near the Colorado River needed a healer. Every community on the Texas frontier needed a healer, and there were no more doctors out there than there were here. Wherever she went, she would be needed, because that was the condition of the frontier in 1887. And she would rather be needed in a place where someone knew her name as something more than a resource. On the 8th day, she walked to the Creek house, where Matthew McCree had a room, and she knocked on the door of that room, and when he opened it, she said, "Yes." He looked at her for a moment, and she could see the careful composure he maintained give way slightly, like a levee that has held all season and finally, briefly, shows the weight of the water behind it. "Yes," he said. "Yes," she confirmed. "I would like to know more about the land. I would like to know about the farmhouse and the 60 acres and the Colorado River. And I want it clearly understood that I will continue my work wherever we go, because people will need it and I cannot pretend they will not." "I would not ask you to pretend any such thing," he said. "It would be like asking the river not to run." "Also," she said, because she had been raised by a practical woman and she was a practical woman herself, "I believe we should know each other more thoroughly before a formal arrangement is made, and I believe Reverend Calloway in this town is capable of marrying people when the time comes, and I am not willing to be rushed beyond what is sensible." "I agree with all of that entirely," Matthew said. He was smiling now, and it was the first time she had seen him smile in a full, unguarded way, and it changed his face considerably, made it younger and warmer, and she thought that this was a face she could stand to see across a table for a long time. The following weeks in Calico Creek were the happiest Sarah Whitfield had known since her mother died, which was a fact that surprised her with its simplicity. She had not been looking for happiness. She had been doing her work, and happiness had arrived sideways, in the form of a man with a torn arm and a hat in his hand. They rode out to see the broader countryside together on Sundays, she on the steady bay mare she had owned for 4 years, and he on the gray gelding he had arrived on. He showed her how to read the grass for water signs, a skill he had picked up on the cattle drives, and she showed him the spring 3 miles east from which she had hauled clean water during the cholera epidemic, the one detail that had made an essential difference. He told her about the specific contours of good rangeland, what the soil needed to be and how the grass varieties varied, and she told him about the medical botany her mother had taught her, the prairie plants with healing properties and how to prepare them. They were teaching each other their worlds, and there was an intimacy in that exchange that was different from the intimacy of proximity. It was the intimacy of being genuinely interested in how another person thinks. He kissed her for the first time on a Sunday afternoon in late September, at the edge of a limestone ridge with the hill country spread below them in the yellow-gold haze of early autumn. They had been sitting on a flat rock, talking about the particular quality of light in this part of Texas, which he said reminded him of the light in Kentucky in October, and she had been about to respond when he had turned to her with that deliberate, careful manner that was entirely characteristic of him and said, "May I?" She had understood the question and answered it by staying still, and the kiss was brief and unhurried and tasted faintly of the coffee they had brought in a canteen. And when it was done, she felt something settle in her chest with a quiet, final sound, like the last piece of something fitting into place. "All right then," she said, because she was not someone who knew what to do with her own emotions in the immediate aftermath of them. "All right then," he agreed, and took her hand, and they sat there in the light until the sun began its descent and they had to head back to town. In October, Matthew sent the letter to San Antonio confirming his intention to purchase the land. He had to ride to the telegraph office in Harrington, which was a 14-mile round trip, and he did it in a day and came back sunburned and satisfied. Sarah began, quietly and methodically, to think about what she would take from the cabin. The medical supplies, of course, and her mother's books, and the satchel. The practical items. She had not accumulated much in the way of possessions that were not practical, which she thought said something accurate about the last 9 years. She told no one in Calico Creek that she was leaving except Hector Dunmore, who received the information with the expression of a man receiving news of a minor inconvenience, and Mrs. Perez, who received it with the expression of a woman who had been waiting for this and was glad it had come. "Your mother would be glad," Mrs. Perez said, taking both Sarah's hands in hers. "She used to worry. She would say, 'Consuela, Sarah will give everything and get nothing, and I don't know how to teach her to want more for herself.' She worried about that." Sarah had to press her lips together for a moment. "She never said that to me." "No," Mrs. Perez said, "she would not have, but I am saying it now in her place. You deserve something that is yours." The wedding took place on the 15th of November, 1887, in the Calico Creek Church, with Reverend Calloway officiating and approximately 30 people in attendance, most of whom came because weddings were events in small towns and for no particular personal warmth toward the bride. Mrs. Perez sat in the front pew and wept openly and with great satisfaction. Hector Dunmore stood in the back and left early. Sarah wore her best dress, which was a deep blue wool that her mother had made for her years ago and which she had preserved carefully. Matthew wore a dark coat he had acquired in Harrington that was perhaps slightly too large across the shoulders but was otherwise respectable, and he stood at the front of the church with the composed, steady manner that she had come to recognize as his way of containing things he felt strongly. When she walked up the aisle, there was a moment, she would remember it for the rest of her life, when he looked at her and his composure shifted, not broke, but shifted, the way the surface of still water shifts when something moves beneath it, and she thought, "He sees me. He is standing at the front of this church, and he is seeing me, Sarah Whitfield, not the woman who nurses people back to life, and then disappears back into her quiet routine, but me." And the full weight of what that meant after 9 years of being looked through settled on her with an almost physical force. She walked the remaining distance with her head up and her eyes clear, and her heart making a considerable amount of noise behind her ribs. "I do," she said, when the moment came, and her voice was steady and certain, and she meant it with every practical, determined fiber of her being. "I do," Matthew said, and he turned his ring on her finger with a careful precision that seemed to her entirely characteristic. They left Calico Creek 3 days later, in a wagon loaded with Sarah's belongings and a good portion of Matthew's gear. The morning was cold and clear, the sky a deep November blue that had no sentiment in it whatsoever, which she appreciated. She did not look back when the wagon pulled away. She was not, by nature or by practice, a woman who looked back. The land near the Colorado River was called the McCree property from the moment Matthew signed the papers at the county clerk's office in the nearby town of Ridgely, which was a small but settled community of about 400 souls situated in a crook of the river where the land flattened and opened generously. The farmhouse was as described, modest, sound, with 2 rooms and a lean-to addition at the back, and a stone fireplace that drew well and a deep porch that looked out over the grassland toward the river. Sarah stood on that porch on the first full morning in their new home, with a cup of coffee she had made in her own kitchen using coffee she had ground herself from the bag of beans she had packed as a deliberate priority. And she looked at the 60 acres of pale winter grass and the silver thread of the river in the middle distance and the enormous sky that was different here than in Calico Creek, wider and more open, and she thought, "This is mine. This piece of sky is mine." Matthew came out with his own cup and stood beside her, and they watched the morning come up together without needing to speak about it. The first winter on the property was demanding in the particular way that all frontier winters are demanding, which is to say it required everything you had, and then required more. The farmhouse needed work that Matthew had been prepared to do, but that was more extensive than anticipated, and the range needed fencing that was extensive and physical, and not helped by the cold. Sarah did her share of the physical work without being asked, because she had never been a person who waited to be asked, and she also began the process of establishing herself in Ridgely. She visited the town doctor, a man named Dr. Horace Emmett, who was past 60 and had been practicing in Ridgely for 20 years and who was, she could see within 15 minutes of meeting him, both excellent at his work and limited by his age. He walked with a cane, and his hands had developed a slight tremor in recent years that he managed around with great skill, but that made certain procedures difficult. He received Sarah with the wary curiosity of a man who expected to feel threatened and was pleasantly surprised to find he was not. "I have no formal medical training," she said, sitting across from him in his office, which smelled of camphor and old books. "But I have 9 years of practical experience and I have read everything I could obtain. I'm not looking to replace you, doctor. I am looking to be useful." Horace Emmett studied her for a long moment. "What was the nature of the 3 epidemics you mentioned?" "Cholera, typhoid, and measles," she said. "And you managed them essentially alone." "Essentially," she said, another long study. "Can you suture?" "Yes," she said. "Reduce a dislocation?" "Yes." "Set a fracture?" "Yes, though I would want your guidance on any complex break." "Honest," he said. It seemed to please him. "Come Thursday, I will see what you know." The partnership that developed between Sarah and Dr. Emmett over the following months was one of those arrangements that works because both parties bring different things and neither resents the other for it. He had the formal knowledge and the community trust of 2 decades. She had the endurance and the particular skills of someone who had operated in crisis without support. He taught her the anatomy she had learned partially and imperfectly from books. She reminded him, he said on more than one occasion, that speed and decisiveness had their place alongside thoroughness. They respected each other, and in the frontier context of 1887 Texas, that was a better arrangement than most. The community of Ridgely learned about Sarah McCree. She was using the new name now, and found she did not mind the change at all, in the way that small communities learn about anyone useful, which is gradually and then all at once. A rancher's wife brought in a child with a broken wrist, and Sarah said it cleanly, and word moved. A family living 8 miles out on the eastern grass had a difficult birth, and Dr. Emmett was occupied with a case in town, and Sarah rode out alone in the dark and delivered a healthy boy and kept the mother's bleeding under control and came home at dawn with blood on her coat, and the particular hollowed-out satisfaction of a thing done exactly as hard as it needed to be done. Word moved further. Through all of it, Matthew was there. This was the thing that she had not known to expect, because she had not had it before. He was there when she came home at dawn with blood on her coat, and he had hot coffee waiting and said nothing of consequence until she had drunk half of it, at which point he asked how the birth had gone and listened to the answer with full attention. He was there on the evenings when she came home from a hard case with the flatness in her eyes that he had learned to recognize, and he did not ask her to speak about it until she was ready. But he made sure she ate, and he kept the fire going, and he sat with her in the specific, useful silence of a person whose presence is itself a form of sustenance. In February of 1888, he built an addition onto the farmhouse. A proper examination room with good windows for light and shelves for Sarah's supplies, and a solid table at the right height for working. He did it over 2 weeks, working in the cold with the methodical determination that characterized everything he did, and when he showed it to her, it was practical and clean and exactly right, and she stood in the middle of it with her hands at her sides and felt something that was too large for the room but that lived there comfortably nonetheless. "You built me a clinic," she said. "I built you a room where you can do your work properly," he said. "The difference matters." She turned to him. "Why?" She asked, and the question meant more than it said. He considered it. He had a way of taking her serious questions seriously, of not deflecting them with easy answers, which she had come to value beyond easy expression. "Because your work matters," he said. "Because you have been doing it without the right conditions for a very long time, and that seemed like something that could be corrected. And because," he paused, and a slight warmth came into his face that was not from the cold. "Because watching you work is one of the finest things I have ever had the opportunity to observe, and I would like the conditions of that work to be worthy of it." Sarah Whitfield, who had nursed strangers through 3 epidemics and never once asked for thanks, who had lived for 9 years in the assumption that what she gave would simply be consumed without acknowledgement, looked at her husband in the examination room he had built her with his own hands and felt, for the second time in his presence, the hot press of tears against the back of her eyes. This time she did not turn away. She crossed the room and took his face in both her hands, her capable, calloused, medical hands, and she kissed him in the way of a person who has decided that emotion does not need to be contained. And he held her with the same specific, careful attentiveness that he brought to everything. And outside, the February wind moved across the 60 acres of grass, and the Colorado River ran silver in the distance, and the sky was enormous and entirely theirs. Spring arrived on the Colorado River property with a particular generosity that Sarah had not expected, having come from the drier hill country east. The grass came in green and thick, and the cottonwoods along the river bank put out their new leaves in a haze of pale gold green that made the morning light extraordinary. Matthew planted a kitchen garden alongside the farmhouse, an endeavor he undertook with the same systematic approach he brought to range work, and Sarah contributed to it the knowledge of medicinal herbs her mother had taught her, so that the garden became both productive and purposeful in equal measure. There were hard things, too. The frontier of 1887 and 1888 Texas was not a gentle place, and the injustices of the era pressed in from every direction in ways that Sarah felt acutely given her work. The Mexicano families who lived along the river's southern bends had less access to care and more need of it, and Sarah made a point of riding out to them with the same regularity she applied to the Anglo families closer to Ridgely, which generated a small amount of comment in the town that she addressed by ignoring it entirely. A group of Comanche families who moved seasonally through the region had been pushed to the edges of everything by the relentless expansion of settlement, their children malnourished, and their elders ill with diseases that had come from contact they had not chosen. Sarah brought what she could to them as well, working through a bilingual Mexican rancher named Don Fernando who served as her translator, and she did it without ceremony and without the need for it to be acknowledged. Matthew, when he understood what she was doing, said only, "Tell me what supplies you need. I will make sure you have them." "It may cause difficulty," she said honestly. "I expect it may," he said with equal honesty. "Tell me what supplies you need." This was, she understood, the nature of who he was. He was not a man who held convenient opinions or shied from inconvenient ones. He had grown up in Kentucky in the years surrounding the war, and whatever he had seen in that time had left him with a clear-eyed reckoning with injustice that he did not announce but did not hide. He helped where he could and did not make it a performance, and did not complain when it was complicated. In the late spring of 1888, Sarah discovered she was carrying their first child. She told Matthew on a May evening when the air was warm and the garden was showing its first proper growth, and the smell of supper was coming from the kitchen. She had been relatively certain for several weeks and had wanted to be thoroughly certain before she spoke, because she was not a woman who made statements without evidence. Matthew was at the table, going over the account book for the property, and he looked up when she sat down across from him with the particular directness that meant she had something important to say. She told him. His reaction was not loud or dramatic. He set down his pen, and he looked at her for a long moment, and then he reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and the expression on his face was something she could not entirely name, but that had in it everything good she had learned to associate with him: steadiness and warmth, and the specific quality of a man who is feeling something deeply and is not ashamed of it. "Are you well?" He asked first because he knew her work and because he was Matthew McCree and he would always ask that first. "I am very well," she said. "Good," he said, and then, "A child." "A child," she confirmed. He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles in a gesture that was tender and formal at once, and she felt the solidity of the moment, the weight of it, the goodness of it, with a clarity that surprised her after years of having to reach for good things and mostly coming up empty. The pregnancy was uncomplicated for most of its duration, which Sarah attributed to the fact that she was generally healthy and physically strong from years of demanding work, and also to the fact that Matthew McCree was possibly the most attentive husband on the Colorado River, a fact she sometimes mentioned to him in a tone of mild irony that concealed genuine gratitude. He did not curtail her medical work, but he drove her to calls when the roads were bad rather than letting her ride alone, and he quietly took on more of the household physical work without making an issue of it, and he read aloud to her in the evenings from the books she requested, which ranged from medical texts to novels that Mrs. Perez had pressed on her before she left Calico Creek, and his voice reading in the firelight was one of the finest sounds she had ever known. On the 22nd of January, 1889, their son was born in the farmhouse, delivered by Dr. Emmett himself with Sarah in her own examination room, which Matthew had lined with every comfort that was practical for the purpose, and which ended with a healthy, vigorous boy with a remarkable amount of dark hair and a strong, indignant voice that he put to use immediately. They named him Thomas, for no particular family reason, but because it sat well and they both felt it suited him. Matthew held Thomas within minutes of his arrival, and Sarah, from the table, watched this, and felt something in her chest that was new and not small. Matthew held the baby with the careful competence of a man who had worked with animals his whole life and understood the weight and fragility of living things, and he looked down at Thomas with an expression that was entirely unguarded, entirely new, entirely his. "Good morning," Matthew said to the baby, quietly and seriously, the way he said good morning to everything. Thomas did not respond intelligibly but made his views known at volume. "He has opinions," Sarah said from the table. "He will get along fine then," Matthew said, and looked up at her with that open, warm face, and she laughed, the good unguarded laugh that she had discovered on Mrs. Perez's roof steps, and it filled the examination room that her husband had built her with his own hands, and Dr. Emmett pretended not to notice that his eyes were slightly wet as he cleaned his instruments. Thomas McCree was, from his first weeks of life, a baby of great expressiveness and considerable energy, which occupied both his parents in ways they had not fully anticipated, and which they rose to with the same combination of practical competence and genuine delight that characterized everything they did. Sarah continued her medical work, adjusting for the reality of a nursing infant with the same systematic problem-solving she applied to everything. Matthew took on the management of the property with increasing skill, extending the range operations, building a small herd of good cattle, and maintaining the farmhouse and its additions with steady attention. Ridgely grew in these years, as the Texas frontier grew, as settlement pressed westward and families arrived looking for land and permanence. Sarah's practice grew with the town. Dr. Emmett retired formally in the autumn of 1890, with his hands too uncertain for precision work, and he made a formal arrangement with Sarah before he did, sitting across from her in his camphor-scented office for what turned out to be their last professional meeting. He gave her his instrument set, his entire library of medical texts, and his patient records. He also gave her a written statement, which he had prepared carefully in his deliberate old handwriting, stating that in his professional opinion, Sarah McCree was the most capable medical practitioner he had encountered in 30 years of frontier practice, and that the community of Ridgely was fortunate to have her. Sarah read this in the office while Dr. Emmett watched, and she kept her face composed because she was good at that, and then she looked up at him and said, "Thank you, Dr. Emmett. This means a great deal." "It should," he said briskly, which was his manner. "It is entirely accurate." She brought the written statement home and showed it to Matthew, who read it carefully and then looked at her with the expression she had come to think of as his truest face, the one that had no performance in it. "He is right," Matthew said. "He is exactly right." "He is generous," Sarah said. "He is accurate," Matthew repeated, and she did not argue further, because she had learned, in the years of being married to Matthew McCree, that some things were not worth arguing about, and being seen accurately was one of them. The spring of 1891 brought a diphtheria outbreak to the Ridgely area that tested everything Sarah had built in the 4 years since arriving on the Colorado River. It came in March, when the river was running high with snowmelt and the roads were soft and difficult, and it moved through the children of the community with the particular cruelty of diphtheria, which attacks the throat and can kill quickly if not addressed. This was the 4th epidemic of Sarah McCree's working life, and she faced it differently than she had faced the first 3. She was not alone. She had her proper examination room and her fully stocked supplies, and the respect of the community she had built over 4 years. She had Matthew, who organized the supply runs and the communications, and who managed the farmhouse, and Thomas, so that Sarah could spend the nights she needed to spend at patients' bedsides without worrying about what was happening at home. She had the medical texts Dr. Emmett had left her, which included recent papers on diphtheria management that she had been reading since the first case presented. She worked without stopping for what felt like the whole of March, and Matthew brought her food at the examination room when she could not leave, and kept Thomas occupied and fed and safe. And on the nights she came home, he was awake with the lamp on, waiting, and she sat beside him and let herself rest without guilt for the first time in her life, because resting in this house did not mean abandoning her responsibility. It meant trusting him, which she had learned, slowly and against the grain of long habit, was something she was allowed to do. The diphtheria outbreak broke by mid-April. 3 people died, an elderly man and 2 children, both very young, and Sarah carried those losses in the way she carried all her losses, quietly and privately and without transferring them to anyone else. But she was not alone with them, because Matthew asked about each one, not as a matter of curiosity but as a matter of acknowledgement. He wanted to know their names. He wanted to know who they had been. He did not let the losses be abstractions. In the summer of 1891, with the worst of the outbreak behind them and the country green again along the river, Sarah told Matthew she was pregnant with their second child. He received this news the same way he received all important news, with full attention, and the first question being about her health, and then with the warm, settled expression that had become one of the primary features of Sarah's happiness. She was 29 years old, and she was well, and the land was good, and Thomas was growing into a loud, affectionate 2-year-old who showed every sign of being interested in everything in the world, and the life she was living was nothing like the life she had lived in the silent Calico Creek cabin, and she was aware of the difference in the specific way you are aware of the difference between cold and warm. The second child, born in February of 1892, was a girl, which delighted Thomas to a degree that was initially somewhat uncertain in its nature. He patted her head with great force for several weeks until he understood that the appropriate gesture was gentler, and which delighted Matthew in a quieter, deeper way. They named her Alina, for Sarah's mother. On the first morning after Alina's birth, when Sarah was still in the farmhouse bedroom and the baby was in the cradle that Matthew had built from good cedar wood, he sat beside the bed in the chair he had been in for most of the night, and he looked at Sarah and said, "You built all of this." She was tired, beautifully and legitimately tired, and the baby was asleep and Thomas was with the neighboring rancher's wife for the day. "We built it," she said. "I helped," he said. "But you, Sarah, you were already building things long before I arrived. You built those people's lives back in Calico Creek. You built the whole of Ridgely's medical practice. You built Thomas, and now Alina." He paused. "I want to make sure you know that. I want to make sure that is said, clearly and without ambiguity, because I spent too long watching you in that first year looking slightly surprised every time someone acknowledged what you did, and I do not want you to be surprised by it anymore. I want you to expect it." Sarah looked at him from the pillow, her face still carrying the effort of the night and her eyes very clear. "You are a remarkable man, Matthew McCree," she said. "I think you may be the only person who has ever wanted for me what I could not want for myself." "You can want it for yourself now," he said. "You have had enough practice." She reached for his hand, and he gave it to her, and they sat in the morning light of the cedar-scented room with the sound of Alina's small sleeping breaths, and the distant sounds of the Colorado River and the open sky above the 60 acres of good Texas grass. And Sarah thought of everything she had been and everywhere she had been it, and she found that the sum of it was not loss or silence or being looked through, but this. This room, this hand, this man who asked questions that opened things, and the two children who were already the most astonishing facts of her entire life. The years that followed were full and real in all the ways that lives should be. Thomas grew into a boy of enormous curiosity and strong opinions, who followed his mother to the examination room at every opportunity and developed, by the age of 7, a working knowledge of basic wound care that alarmed and impressed the neighboring families in equal measure. Alina grew into a quieter child, but with a wit that came out sideways and caught you off guard, and a particular physical grace that seemed to come from somewhere outside either parent's heritage. She was also her grandmother's name made new, and Sarah took a private pleasure in watching the name move through the world in a new set of expressions. Matthew expanded the ranch operation gradually and prudently, in the manner he did all things, adding cattle slowly and improving the fencing and the water management until the 60-acre property was producing well, and the McCree name in the Ridgely area was associated with a quality of operation that other ranchers noted with respect. He did not become wealthy. Wealthy was not a condition readily available to a ranch of 60 acres in the 1890s Texas frontier. But they were stable, and they were comfortable, and the examination room on the back of the farmhouse was always fully stocked because Matthew made sure of it. The town of Ridgely continued to grow. By 1895, it had a proper schoolhouse, a second general store, a hotel of modest dignity, and a population approaching 800, which was substantial for the river country. Sarah McCree was its primary medical practitioner, by this point with an unassailable reputation built on 8 years of consistent, capable, fearless work. She had delivered approximately 40 children, had managed 4 significant epidemic-scale events, had treated the ranch injuries and farm accidents and ordinary illnesses of 800 people, and had done it with the combination of skill and honesty and fundamental human decency that her mother had built into her years before the work began. She was also, by 1895, beginning to correspond with a medical school in Galveston about the possibility of formal training. The letter writing had been Matthew's suggestion, offered carefully on an evening when she had been frustrated by a case she felt she had managed less well than she should have. A difficult internal injury she had been forced to stabilize and refer to a physician in Austin, rather than treating herself due to the limits of her practical but informal training. "Write to the school," Matthew had said. "Tell them who you are and what you have done. Ask them what you need to know. They will not correspond seriously with a woman without formal credentials," she had said. "Write to them anyway," he said, in the tone that meant he had thought about this and his position was not going to change. "If they are the kind of institution that dismisses what you have done based on your sex, you will know that and you will find another avenue. But start the correspondence and see where it leads." She had written. The school had written back, which had surprised her more than she expected. The response was from a Professor James Whitmore, who was teaching a new class of practical nursing and medical instruction, and who had read her letter with, he wrote, considerable interest. Her experience, he said, was precisely the kind of field knowledge that formal medicine was increasingly recognizing as essential, and while the full medical degree program was not available to women at that time, there were options for formal certification in nursing practice and medical assistance that would give her credentials commensurate with her skill. He invited her to correspond further. Sarah put the letter down and looked at Matthew across the table. He was reading it, she had handed it to him without comment, and when he finished he set it down and met her eyes. "I would have to go to Galveston," she said, "for a period. I know. The children, Thomas is 11. Alina is 3. I have been managing this property and this household for 8 years. I believe I can manage it further. It would be months." "Yes," he said, "it would. And at the end of it you would have credentials on paper that match what you have in your hands, and that would be a right thing." She looked at him for a long time. "You would not ask me to stay." "I would not ask you to stay," he said. "I would ask you to come back, which is an entirely different request and one I believe you will honor." She went to Galveston in the autumn of 1895, when Alina was old enough for the separation, which Sarah calculated with the same care she applied to everything. She was in Galveston for 4 months, living in the modest boarding house that Professor Whitmore's office had recommended, attending the intensive instruction program with a cohort of 12 other women from various parts of Texas and the surrounding territories, most of them younger than Sarah by several years. She was, by universal acknowledgement of both instructors and fellow students, the most practically experienced person in the room, and the formal instruction gave her the vocabulary and the theoretical architecture for what she had been doing by instinct and observation for years. She wrote to Matthew twice a week. He wrote back with the same regularity, letters that were factual about the ranch and the children and the town, and that also contained, in the last paragraph of each, something that was not factual, a sentence or two about the sky some evening, or something Thomas had said that had made him laugh, or the particular way the light came through the kitchen window on a cold morning, and the fact that it was better with her in it. She kept all the letters. She kept them in the cedar box he had built for her in the first year. She came home in February of 1896 with a certificate of formal medical nursing practice, and a trunk full of new books and a particular exhaustion that was not unpleasant. And Matthew met her at the Ridgely station with Thomas and Alina, and the gray gelding successor, a newer horse of equivalent quality, tied to the back of the wagon. And she got down from the train, and Thomas was immediately too tall, and Alina was immediately too grown, and she held both of them for a considerable time before she looked up at Matthew over Alina's head. He was watching her with the green eyes and the steady composure and the warmth that was always there underneath it, and he said, "Welcome home, Mrs. McCree." "Thank you for waiting," she said. "I would wait considerably longer than 4 months," he said, "though I did not enjoy it." "I know," she said. "I did not enjoy it either." She kissed him on the platform of the Ridgely station with Thomas making a sound of protest and Alina watching with great interest, and the other passengers from the train went around them on both sides as though they were a fixed feature of the landscape, which in a manner they were. The years after her return from Galveston were the deepest and richest years of Sarah's life. She had her certificate now, and it changed things in Ridgely in the way formal credentials always change things, not because they made her more capable. They did not, but because they gave other people permission to recognize what had been true all along. She expanded her practice formally, taking on patients who had previously traveled to Austin, establishing a regular arrangement with the county for public health consultations that gave her some formal standing and a small remuneration. She began the correspondence with other female practitioners in Texas that would, over the following decade, become a network of practical importance. Matthew's herd was growing steadily. In 1897, he added 20 more acres to the property when the adjacent parcel came available, which improved the water access and gave the cattle better summer grazing. The farmhouse had been extended over the years into something that was comfortable and particular to them. There were books on every available shelf, Sarah's medical texts alongside the novels and the agricultural publications and the children's primers, and there were practical, beautiful things that accumulated the way they do in homes where someone is paying attention. Mrs. Perez had sent a hand-embroidered tablecloth as a wedding gift that had been on the kitchen table for 10 years and was the finest thing in the house, and Sarah had never replaced it. Thomas, at 13, announced that he wanted to be a doctor. He said it at supper on a Tuesday in 1897 with the seriousness of someone who has been thinking about it for a long time and has decided it is time to make it official. Sarah looked at him across the tablecloth. "Do you?" she said. "Yes," Thomas said. "I want to go to medical school, a proper one. I have been reading Dr. Emmett's old books." He had, in fact, been reading them for 2 years, a fact that had not escaped his mother's notice. "Medical school is expensive and long," she said, "and you would have to leave for it." "I know," Thomas said, with the patience of someone who has anticipated this response. "But there are scholarships at the medical school in Galveston. I have been writing to inquire." Matthew, at the end of the table, made a sound that was not quite laughter but was closely related to it. "He has been writing to inquire," he said, and looked at Sarah with the expression that was specifically reserved for moments when one of their children was undeniably their child in a way that could not be argued. Sarah looked at her son, this 13-year-old who had grown up watching her work and had absorbed it the way she had absorbed everything from her mother, and she felt a fierce, uncomplicated pride that was entirely unlike the quiet satisfaction she felt in her own work. This was something bigger. "We will talk about the scholarship requirements," she said, "and you will need Latin." "I have started Latin," Thomas said. "Mrs. Carver at the school has been teaching me." "Of course she has," Sarah said. Eleanor, at 5, watched this exchange with bright eyes and then said, "I want to be a horse," which relieved the solemnity of the moment considerably. Thomas did go to Galveston, eventually, in 1903, at 19 years old, with a partial scholarship and his mother's medical library, and a trunk full of practical experience that no other first-year student in the program possessed. He went with his parents' blessing and his sister's indignation at being left behind, and he wrote home with a regularity that his mother found impressive and his father found fully appropriate. But that was the future, and the present had its own completeness. In the autumn of 1898, Calico Creek came back into Sarah's life in an unexpected form. A letter arrived from a woman named Clara Dunmore, the wife of Hector Dunmore, the general store owner, and it contained the information that Calico Creek had been without any medical care for 3 years since the last traveling physician had moved on, and that the town was in some difficulty, and that Sarah's name had come up in conversation, and would she be willing to advise on how to attract a practitioner to the area, given her experience. Sarah read this letter twice and set it on the kitchen table. Matthew, who had seen the return address from Calico Creek, asked her about it over supper that night, and she told him what it said. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I do not want to go back," she said, which surprised her with its directness. "I want to help them find someone, but I do not want to go back." Then help them find someone, Matthew said. She wrote back to Clara Dunmore. She wrote 3 letters over the following months, with the names of practitioners she knew through her professional network who might be suitable, with practical advice about what a small frontier community could offer as inducements, with the clear-eyed assessment of someone who knew exactly what Calico Creek needed and had some experience in providing it. Whether any of it helped she could not be sure, but she had done what she could, which was what she had always done. She did not receive a reply from Clara Dunmore, which she noted without bitterness. Some things did not change. On the evening of the 11th anniversary of their arrival on the Colorado River property, Matthew had remembered the date, because Matthew remembered dates they sat on the farmhouse porch in the November dark with cups of coffee, and the particular comfort of people who have been in the same place long enough to have opinions about the stars. 11 years. Sarah was 37. Matthew was 42. Alina was 7 and asleep inside, and Thomas was at the neighbor's for the weekend, and the cattle were quiet on the winter grass, and the river was running low and silver in the distance. "I have been thinking," Matthew said. "About what?" she asked, though she could tell from his tone that it was something specific. "About whether you are content," he said. She looked at him. "Why would you question that?" "I do not question it," he said. "I think about it. Regularly. It matters to me whether you are content, not in a worried way, but in the way that something important is always present in your thinking." He paused. "I want to ask you, as I have been meaning to ask more frequently and have been neglecting to ask because you make it easy to assume you are all right. Are you content, Sarah?" She was quiet for a moment, looking at the dark shape of the grass and the stars above it. Content. It was a careful word for what she was, and she appreciated the carefulness of it. "Do you remember what you asked me on Mrs. Perez's porch steps in 1887, she said. "You know that I do," he said. "You asked what it cost me," she said. "I could not answer at the time. I did not know how to answer that without crying, which I did anyway." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "What I know now, 11 years later, is that cost is not the right frame. Everything costs something. The cholera cost me. The typhoid cost me. The measles cost me, and the diphtheria cost me, and every difficult birth and every patient I have sat with through the night has cost me something. But what I have here," she looked at him in the dark, and she did not qualify what she said next. "What I have here replenishes everything I spend. That is not a thing I knew to hope for, and it is the most significant fact of my entire life." Matthew looked at her in the way he had always looked at her, with the green eyes and the steady warmth and the specific quality of a man who is paying full attention, and he said, "That is the most significant fact of my entire life as well." The coffee was getting cold. Inside, Alina made a small sound in her sleep and then was quiet. The November dark was complete and generous, and the stars were extraordinary, as they always were over the Texas River country, and the 60-plus acres of grass that had once been a stranger's land and was now entirely theirs stretched out in the dark with all the quiet, productive permanence of something well tended. Sarah set down her cup and leaned against her husband's shoulder. He put his arm around her with the ease of 10,000 previous moments, and they sat in the dark together on the porch of their farmhouse on the Colorado River, and there was nothing unresolved between them, no thread left hanging, no acknowledgment withheld. The work was ongoing, as it would always be. The love was ongoing, as it had been from a porch in Calico Creek on a November day with sawdust on their clothes. The children were real and present and full of their own futures. The land was good. Sarah Whitfield, who had become Sarah McCree, who had nursed strangers through 3 epidemics and never once asked for thanks, who had wept the day a man with green eyes and a hat in his hand had asked what all of it cost her, was here, was home, was known in full. She closed her eyes and listened to the river. In the spring of 1900, Alina McCree, now 8 years old, showed her first serious interest in the garden, specifically in the medicinal herb section that her mother had maintained since their first year on the property. She spent an entire Saturday afternoon following Sarah through the rows, asking the name and purpose of each plant, with an intensity that her mother recognized immediately as the same intensity with which Thomas had once read Dr. Emmett's old books. Sarah answered each question fully and without simplification, as her mother had answered her. Matthew, watching from the porch, saw his wife crouch beside their daughter in the herb garden in the spring light, hands moving over the plants, voice carrying the names and properties and preparations of 20 different medicinal species, and he thought, this is how it continues. This is the chain of knowledge passing from hand to hand and generation to generation, and it is the most essential thing in the world. Thomas sent a letter in June of 1900 from Galveston that was full of his first-year medical studies, the anatomy and the chemistry, and the clinical rotations that were beginning to show him how much his mother's practical knowledge corresponded to and supplemented the formal instruction. He wrote at the end of the letter, "My professor asked how I knew about wound irrigation technique without having been taught it in class. I told him my mother had shown me. He asked if she was a physician. I said she was something considerably better, which I believe was accurate." Sarah read this out loud at the table, and Matthew listened, and Alina demanded to know what wound irrigation meant, and the evening went on in the particular fashion of evenings in that household, which was warmly and at some volume and with full attention from all parties. They had a good doctor now in Ridgely, a young man named Dr. Frank Hale, who had arrived in 1898 fresh from his own Galveston training, and who had the intelligence to recognize immediately that Sarah McCree was an asset rather than a competition. They worked together comfortably, he taking the more complex surgical cases, and she managing the bulk of the community health work with the efficiency of someone who had been doing it for 2 decades. And between them, the 800 people of Ridgely and its surroundings were better served than most frontier communities 10 times its size. The Galveston hurricane came in September of 1900, and though Ridgely was far enough inland to escape its worst force, the news that came through in the following days of the devastation on the island city was terrible. Sarah worried for Thomas, who was in his 2nd year at the medical school, and the days before the letter arrived were among the longest of her life. Matthew did not tell her not to worry. He sat beside her and waited with her, which was what she needed. Thomas's letter arrived 9 days after the storm. He was safe. He had been part of the medical school's emergency response teams in the aftermath, working in the disaster field stations for the first weeks after the hurricane, and the letter described what he had seen in terms that his mother recognized as the controlled clinical language of a person who had experienced something large and was containing it with work and precision. At the end of the letter he wrote, "I understand now what it cost you, and I understand why you kept going. The work is the answer to the cost, isn't it? It is its own justification. I think you knew that all along." Sarah folded the letter and held it in her hands for a moment and did not say anything. Matthew, beside her, reached over and covered her hands with his. "He is all right," he said. "He is all right," she said. "He is also his mother's son," Matthew said. She looked at her husband across the kitchen table, across the embroidered tablecloth that had been there since 1887, in the house they had built into a home over 13 years, and she said, "Thank you." He looked slightly surprised, which was rare. "For what specifically?" "For asking," she said. "That morning on Mrs. Perez's steps, for asking what it cost, for asking and for everything that came after the asking." Matthew McCree took both her hands in his and held them in the way of a man who holds something irreplaceable and knows it. "I asked," he said, "because I wanted to know you. I have never stopped wanting to know you. And I consider myself the most fortunate man on the Colorado River, and possibly in all of Texas, for having been thrown from a fence at exactly the right moment in exactly the right direction." Sarah laughed. It was her good, full, unguarded laugh, the one that had started on a rooftop in Calico Creek 13 years ago, the one she gave freely now because she had learned, through long and loving practice, that she was allowed. The sun came through the kitchen window the way it always did in the late morning, falling across the embroidered tablecloth and the coffee cups, and the hands of two people who had found each other in the ordinary improbability of a broken fence on a hot August day, and had built from that accident something as real and lasting as the land itself. Alina came running in from the garden with a fistful of rosemary, holding it up triumphantly and announcing its name and three of its medicinal properties in the precise, confident tone of a child who has been paying attention, and Sarah released Matthew's hands and turned to her daughter and said, "That's right. What else do you remember?" And the morning went on. The river ran in the distance. The grass grew in the 60-acre field. The cattle moved slowly in the late autumn warmth. Thomas was in Galveston, studying the formal architecture of what his mother had built from instinct. Alina was in the kitchen, learning the names of things. Matthew McCree was at the table, in the home they had made, listening to his daughter recite the properties of rosemary with the attention of a man who considers listening to the people he loves to be the principal occupation of a good life. Sarah Whitfield, who had nursed strangers through 3 epidemics and never once asked for thanks, stood in the morning light of her kitchen on the Colorado River and understood with full and quiet certainty that she had everything.